Welcome to this session on the topic Factors Affecting Counseling Process. In the previous video, we learned that there are 5 stages in the counseling process. These are rapport establishment stage, problem assessment, goal setting, intervention strategies, and finally termination and follow-up. So there are various factors that might affect the counseling process during these stages. We can categorize these factors under the following heads, such as factors related to the physical setting of the counseling situation, factors related to the counseling process, then third one is counselor related factors, and finally the client related factors. So in this video today, we will discuss each of these factors and how these factors are going to affect the effectiveness of the counseling process. Let us discuss each of these factors now. The first is physical setting. The physical setting in which the counseling takes place can be an important factor in influencing the effectiveness of counseling. When the client enters the counselor's room, the client should feel comfortable in the particular situation. Now, let us focus on what are the different aspects in the counselor's room that can influence the counseling process. Okay, because these different aspects of the counselor's room can make the client comfortable and relaxed, and it can help in easing the tension and stress of the client. For instance, the room temperature. Let us look at the room temperature, which should be proper. If it is too hot, the client may feel uncomfortable. If it is too cold also, the client may feel uncomfortable. Okay. So the room temperature needs to be proper depending on the climate at that particular time. If it is summer or winter or whatever the season, accordingly a comfortable room temperature needs to be maintained. Okay, so that the client feels comfortable upon entering the counselor's room. Further, the room should be properly lighted with ventilation. That means there should be properly lighting of the room. It should not be too much lighted or very dimly lighted, and ventilation also should be there. The client should not feel suffocated in the particular room in which the counseling will be taking place. And also there should not be any clutter around in the room. That means the room should be neatly arranged with minimum things and properly placed in different places in the particular room. Okay. So the counseling room needs to look neat and clean. Okay. Because all this will give the room a pleasant feeling when the client is entering in that room. Further, we can say that the room should have pleasant and soothing colors also, because when the client enters the room, the client is coming with their own problems or issues or anxieties. They may be feeling anxiety or stressed up. Okay. So when they enter the counselor's room, the room of the counselor should be pleasant in nature. It should look inviting to the client. The client should feel a sense of relaxedness in that particular atmosphere. There should not be any distractions or noise or any other kind of disturbance in and around the room. Because if the counselor's room is located in a very busy market, then there may be a lot of noise around. The traffic noise or so many other kind of noises also might be there around. Because whenever the counseling happens, the counselor and client relationship, that requires that it should be confidential. Whatever the client is sharing with the counselor, it needs to be confidential. So that is why privacy is important. There needs to be privacy in the counselor's room. It can be that the counselor can put do not disturb sign on the outside of the room. Further, the disturbance might come from the mobile also, or the laptop also, or the computer also. So that is why the counselor needs to ensure that he or she has put the mobile on silent mode, or they are not looking at the laptop or the computer while interacting with the client. And the counselor also should not do anything else while communicating with the client or while interacting with the client. Because it is important to remember that the client should get undivided attention of the counselor. The client has come to you with their own problems or issues, or whatever their problems or sufferings are there, and they have come with the hope that the counselor will listen to them and take care of their problem, and they will find a solution to their problem. So that is why the counselor needs to provide undivided attention to the client, so that the client develops confidence on the counselor, and also the client develops trust on the counselor to share about their own inner anxieties or frustrations or the issues that they are facing. So this will ensure that the client develops trust and confidence on the counselor. That is why it is very important to ensure that the counselor's room is proper. Further, we can see here that the counselor should keep in mind their sitting position, the posture or the gesture or the body language, the eye movement, the eye contact, and the voice, tone and facial expressions while interacting with the client. Now let us discuss about these things, how they are going to affect the counseling process. For example, the eye contact. If you are taking the eye contact, then we can see here that the counselor and the client, the eye contact should be proper. It should not feel intimidating, or the counselor also should not avoid eye contact with the client. Similarly, when we are talking about the voice tone, okay, how the counselor is talking to the client, the voice of the counselor, that also should be pleasant to the client. It should not be very harsh, or it should not be very rough while interacting with the client. So counselor needs to take care of how they are talking to the client, their voice tone. Further, the facial expressions also. Now this also is very important, because while interacting with the client, the counselor might be using the body language, maybe making various gestures or various expressions in the face that might come. So the counselor need to take care that the facial expression is also proper. That means if the client is sharing certain issues or the problem or the suffering that he or she is going through, and the counselor might make certain facial expression which might indicate that the counselor is not approving of what the client is telling. So that might put off the client, might make the client nervous, or might make the client hesitant in expressing further. So as a counselor, you need to ensure, you need to take care of your facial expressions, that you are providing proper gestures, proper facial expressions while interacting with the client, so that the client doesn't feel intimidated, doesn't feel frustrated, or the client feels confident and is able to develop trust on the counselor. There should not be anything obstructing between the client and the counselor. Okay. For example, there is a table between the client and the counselor. So the space between the client and counselor should be open. Okay. If there is a table in between, then that might be considered as a hindrance, might hamper the open expression of the client. Okay. So both the client and the counselor can be seated at a 90-degree angle, okay, which gives the freedom to the client, because when you are sitting in a 90-degree angle, either the client can look ahead, not looking at the counselor directly if the client feels so, or the client can look at the counselor also in a comfortable manner. So that is why this 90-degree angle is usually suggested for sitting the client and the counselor. Now, as I have explained you earlier, the eye contact also should be maintained. It should not be staring or avoiding the client. The tone or voice of the counselor also should be very pleasant, because it builds up the confidence of the client on the counselor, and further the counselor should pay attention to what gestures or what facial expressions they are making. Like if you take another instance, if the counselor expresses dissatisfaction towards the client. If the counselor expresses dissatisfaction or disliking in their facial expression or in their body language when the client is saying something unpleasant about them or about their inability or about their shortcomings, then if the counselor expresses unpleasantness in their facial expression, this will disconnect the client. For example, like when the client narrates his loss of job, the client has lost a job. Okay. If the counselor's body language indicates that the client is responsible for it, the client is responsible for the job loss, then the client gets that indication and the client will not be able to develop trust on the counselor. Okay. So that is why it is very important to be careful about what kind of body language we are showing, what kind of facial expressions we are showing as counselor towards the client. However, this doesn't mean that the counselor should hide or fake his or her expressions. Okay. Rather, it shows the importance of what kind of personal qualities the counselor needs to have. The counselor needs to be genuine in their approach. The counselor needs to have empathetic attitude towards the client and should be non-judgmental in their approach towards the client. So when the counselor is non-judgmental, when the counselor shows empathy towards the client, this will naturally ensure that the body language of the counselor or the facial expressions, the gestures of the counselor will be accordingly. It will be proper towards the whatever the client is sharing. We will learn more about all these things when we discuss client-related factors in this video that influence counseling effectiveness. Now here, when we are discussing about the physical setting, the first factor that affects counseling process, let us learn about the SOLER technique to be used by the counselor, that is SOLER. Here S stands for facing the client squarely. That indicates a posture of involvement. When you are looking at the client straight, that indicates that you are involved in the communication. O refers to open posture, that is, it indicates that you are not crossing your arms or legs. It indicates crossing of arms and legs, that indicates usually a closed posture. So as a counselor, you should not be crossing your arms or legs while sitting, because that indicates an open posture. Now, what is the importance of an open posture? Because that will indicate that you are listening to the client. It indicates again a sense of involvement in whatever the client is communicating to you or sharing with you. Now L stands for lean forward towards the client, that is, you are slightly leaning forward towards the client when you are interacting with the client or the client is sharing things with you, because this indicates an interest in the client. This indicates that you are actually listening to the client. You need to take care that you are not leaning towards the client in a major way, okay, or you are not leaning much towards the client, but leaning very slightly towards the client. So that you need to take care of. Because this also, if you are leaning too much towards the client, that will violate the personal space of the client. Now E refers to eye contact. That eye contact, a proper eye contact with the client, that indicates that you are listening to the client. And as I have explained earlier, it should not be, the eye contact should not be staring at the client or avoiding the client or looking down on the floor or looking at the side direction or something like that. Okay. It should be looking at the client but in a pleasant manner. It should not be staring at the client. And finally, the R in the SOLER, it stands for relaxed position. Okay. That is, it indicates that as a counselor, you can be relied upon, and a relaxed posture by the counselor, it builds trust of the client on you. Okay. Here also again, I can say that relaxed posture means that it should not be, the counselor should not just sit back in a very relaxed manner. The counselor should not be sitting in a very relaxed manner, okay, in a lazy manner. Relaxed in the sense that the client should get the feeling that the counselor is in a relaxed manner, the counselor is taking interest in whatever the client is sharing, the counselor is maintaining a proper eye contact with the client and is showing proper gestures and facial expressions. That indicates the counselor's involvement, a relaxing attitude towards the client, but at the same time taking interest and paying attention and listening to the client. Now let us see the second factor, that is factors related to the counseling process itself that can affect the effectiveness of the counseling. Counseling process consisting of the 5 stages form the mainstay of the counseling service provided to the client. Hence, it is important to look into what are the various factors related to the counseling process itself, the different stages that are there in the counseling process, how these different stages can affect the effectiveness of the counseling process. The relationship between the counselor and client, it is not subjective, because usually when we say relationship, we think that it is subjective in nature. But in the context of counseling, when we are talking about counselor-client relationship, it is not subjective in nature, rather this relationship is objective in nature. And this objectivity is achieved by putting a structure to the counseling relationship and the counseling process. So structure is very important in counseling process, which can affect the counseling effectiveness. Structure is provided to counseling sessions at each stage of counseling process. However, it is very important to establish a structure in the beginning of counseling itself. This facilitates clarity about the counseling process. So client knows what to expect, and also client knows what not to expect, and further what the outcomes of the counseling process will be, and how the counseling will progress throughout these different stages. So structure helps the client in knowing about all these things. It also helps in putting limits or boundaries. That is, the client is able to know what will happen during the counseling process. So the structure, it clearly demarcates different things. We can say here that the structure, it helps the client in the following ways. For example, the first thing is that putting a time limit, like duration of each counseling session. Okay. So the counselor should be informing the client about the duration of each counseling session, that the counseling session will happen for this much duration, and also how many counseling sessions might be required for the kind of problem or the issue with which the client has come. So the time limit, it informs the client about the duration of each session and also how many sessions the client might require. And this time limit is very important because the client will feel comfortable, the client will be able to know that, okay, I am going to have these many sessions or with the counselor so that I can get a proper counseling. Similarly, structure also provides role limits. That is, what will be the counselor's role and what will be the client's roles and responsibilities. And this role limit, this is very important because whenever the client comes to the counselor, they might have different expectations. They might not be knowing about what exactly is counseling, how counseling happens, what are the things that they themselves need to be doing as part of counseling. Sometimes, usually what happens is that the client comes to the counselor with the hope that the counselor will provide the solution to the client's problems. It is like the fever is there, the doctor gives you a medicine and your fever is gone. So many times the client might have unrealistic expectations. So in counseling, it doesn't happen that way. Next, there are action limits also. The structure puts an action limits, that is, what to express and how to express. Okay. For example, the client or the counselor should not be using any abusive language or any kind of offensive language. So what actions are allowed during the counseling process or what actions are permitted during the counseling process, that also is conveyed to the client in the counseling process. Structure also provides procedural limits, that is, Clients need to work on agreed upon goals and take action. However, the structure is not a rigid one to be imposed on the client, but it can be established taking into account the client's needs. Counseling skills used by the counselor are also important in all the 5 stages of counseling. Use of appropriate counseling skills will enable the client to gain perspective on their situation and the problems, and this will help the client achieve catharsis and insight into the problems or issues. It will thus enabling the client to lead a healthy life. Creating a therapeutic climate is also very important. Counseling skills need to be used by the counselor for this, because trust and acceptance are important in ensuring a therapeutic climate. The client should feel understood and feel accepted by the counselor. Further, an effective communication channel needs to be there between the client and the counselor. Let us see some barriers to communication here. The barriers can be giving advice, judging, criticizing, preaching to the client, or providing solutions to the client, and analyzing things for the client. Next, let us see what are the counselor related factors. Factors related to the counselor may also impact the effectiveness of the counseling provided. Counselor needs to have proper educational qualification in the related field, also the requisite training or internship in this. Further, the personal qualities of the counselor are also very important factors that affects the counseling effectiveness. For instance, counselor needs to have unconditional positive regard for the client. The counselor should be genuine towards the client, have empathetic attitude and good listening skills, and so on. Good communication skills are also very important to have. Counselor should conduct himself or herself in such a way that the client develops trust and confidence on the counselor and feels free to open up during the counseling situation. Counselors should be aware about their own values and belief systems, should have an open attitude, open communication, and not criticize or pass judgments on the client's issues or problems. So that is why self-awareness, genuineness, ability to reflect, accepting the client and showing empathy towards the client, and having client's welfare as a top priority, and at the same time taking care of their own well-being. So all these are important factors which affect the effectiveness of the counseling. Further, counselors' perceived expertise. The client should feel that the counselor is expert in the field. The credibility of the counselor, the trustworthiness of the counselor is very important, because that also can affect the effectiveness of the client and the client continuing in the counseling process itself. Further, counselor needs to have multicultural competence, because clients come from diverse backgrounds and cultures. Each culture has their own beliefs, values, and norms that impacts the way the client functions. So you need to, as a counselor, you need to take care of this thing, that you have multicultural competence. That means that you are aware about your own culture, value system, belief system, and also the client's background also. Okay, because all these factors might affect counseling. Now let us see the next factor, that is client related factors that affect the effectiveness of counseling. Here we can see that the client's personality, motivation, and initiative, the source of referral, their background, and the contextual factors. All these factors are important factors that might impact the effectiveness of counseling. The cultural background of the client may affect how counseling is perceived by the client. If the client belongs to a high socioeconomic background, and if the client is more intelligent, has more verbal fluency, they may be able to reflect on their issues or the problems during the counseling situation. They might be able to see things from different perspectives and accordingly modify their thoughts, perceptions, or behavior easily. But if the client comes from a background or a context where there is lack of social support, that also might affect the progress in counseling, because during the counseling situation the client might do things, but when the client goes back to the context, the social context to which the client belongs, there the client may not get any social support to do all those things. Further, we can see here that the client who takes the initiative and the client is well motivated, they will do better during the counseling situation. They will have better outcomes out of the counseling process. Rather, those clients who are not motivated enough to take some action in their life, they might not be getting better outcomes from the counseling situation. Further, another important factor related to the client here is the source of referral. Okay. This might affect the counseling process. If the client is self-referred, that is, has come on his or her own for counseling, they are likely to be more motivated and they can take more initiative during the counseling process. However, if the client has been referred by others, maybe by the parents or maybe by the teachers or maybe by the supervisor or the boss at the workplace, they may be motivated, but chances are there that they may be reluctant clients or resistant clients. Okay. That is, reluctant clients, they do not want counseling at all. Resistant clients may be willing, but they resist the process of change that is required as part of progress in counseling. For instance, two friends may want to improve their relationship, but may not be willing to put in the amount of effort that is required in the relationship for them to improve, because this requires that they need to move beyond their comfort zones. So here the counselor needs to use appropriate skills of confrontation and persuasion to motivate the client, and also the counselor needs to show acceptance towards the client so that the client feels motivated to get involved in the counseling. Further, the counselor also needs to be non-judgmental in their attitude and demonstrate an accepting attitude towards the client. So learners, at the end, to conclude, in this video you learned about various factors that can affect the effectiveness of the counseling process. So we have factors related to the physical setting. Next is we have factors related to the counseling process itself, then counselor related factors and client related factors. So we will meet again in the next video with the topic ethical guidelines in counseling. Till then, happy learning.